legacy of tragedy, a shameful part of our collective history, one that we were forcefully reminded of over the summer by a series of disturbing discoveries in Canada. More than 1,000 unmarked graves of children at the sites of 3 former Indian residential schools. There were 130 of these schools in Canada, another 376 in the United States, including the notorious Mohawk institution known as the Mush Hole near Brantford, Ontario. And here in Western New York, the Thomas Indian School on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. Now, supporters, even some former students, said they taught valuable lessons in how to live life off the reservation. But the vast majority of survivors and their descendants say these were places of abuse, trauma, and attempted ethnic cleansing. Over the next 30 minutes, we will explore the history and the lasting impacts. Tragic legacy, the unknown story of the Indian residential school program. This 1929 film shows Native children at a school in Arizona singing a nursery song. It was a song originally written about counting dead Indians.
Our communities are still mourning.
Many in Native communities across North America say the discoveries are just the tip of the iceberg, especially now that U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, herself a Native American, has opened an investigation into the U.S. schools.
I come from ancestors who endured the horrors of Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead.
The first U.S. government-run school was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, opened in 1879 by Brigadier General Richard Pratt.
Army officer Richard Pratt coined the phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
And the numbers are eye-opening. According to Reconciliation Canada, in the Canadian schools, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families. 90 to 100% suffered severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. And there was a 40 to 60% mortality rate in Indian residential schools. In the United States, the exact numbers are not known, but by 1925, there were nearly 61,000 children in boarding schools. The practice continued in the U.S. until 1968, when it was ended by President Lyndon Johnson. The last school in Canada finally closed in 1996.
This is a building we walked into.
Businessman J.C. Seneca showed me what remains of the Thomas School, which stood on the Cattaraugus territory until 1958. He recalled a time as a little boy walking through this building with his father, a Thomas School survivor.
And just the echo and the sound of my dad's crutch as he walked, was pretty an eerie feeling.
It has been renovated into the Peacekeepers Court building. And Seneca says it's important to keep it as a reminder because the echoes of the past abuse continue to resonate. Thomas School survivor Elliot Tallchief recalls that they were not even allowed to speak their native language.
Using our language, they would line us up and take us to the shower. They would wash our mouth out with soap.
Carson Waterman says as a small child, he and another boy got caught sneaking out of their dormitory building to see his older brother.
He told us we had to get in the shower, we had to take our clothes off. We were wearing shorts, it was summertime, shorts and t-shirts. And he beat us with a rubber hose. We were 5 years old. What kind of society beats their children with rubber hoses when they're that young?
And Alita Bowen, a Navajo, says among her most vivid memories of her school out west was the sight of piles and piles of hair left behind when new students had their traditional long hair sheared off.
And all those yarn were laying all over, and then on this other side is all the Navajo boys had.
The purpose of the policy was to assimilate us.
University at Buffalo assistant professor Alyssa Mount Pleasant specializes in Native American history. She says the approach was actually taken before formal schools were actually set up.
The United States recognized that it could not afford to prosecute wars, right? And so they decided at a policy level that they needed to have another parallel approach.
The church originated modern-day slavery to this day.
And former Seneca Nation President Dennis Bowen says the mission was actually set forth by the papal bull issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493.
In the doctrine of discovery, the church said to Portugal, you can go into West Africa and you can take over the land because they're not Christian. And if they're not with Christ, you can kill them. You can take their land.
And Dennis Bowen says that Europeans acted under that order from the moment Columbus discovered the New World and native populations had their first encounter with white settlers. The methods that were employed to try to assimilate or civilize indigenous people have had lasting impacts that are still being felt today in the form of what is now called intergenerational trauma.
Ripping the culture away from native people. I mean, that was the whole goal.
Dean Seneca is a Seneca who grew up in Buffalo's Old First Ward, going to church, even serving as an altar boy. At the time, he had no idea of what happened to his people or even much about his culture. He spent most of his adult life learning, advocating, and teaching.
Indian kids were beaten if they spoke their language. Their hair was cut. They were put into their traditional dresses were taken away from them. They were put into these uniforms, almost kind of in a military kind of fashion.
He now teaches a course in Indigenous health disparities at his alma mater, the University at Buffalo. The course discusses many of the social problems that continue to plague Native populations, problems that he says are a direct result of generations of trauma inflicted by residential schools.
You know, we had graveyards, where, an Indian child in this school would literally basically, and this is a military kind of psychological use in warfare, if they didn't listen, they could literally look right outside and see the graves of their friends.
Seneca says the system itself severed ties among families. Children were removed and in some cases never reunited, so when they left the school and began having children, they had no idea of what a parent is supposed to do.
There was a lot of psychological abuse in these schools. There was a lot of physical abuse in these schools.
Seneca says the statistics tell the story of the lasting impact of that trauma. Native Americans experience serious psychological distress 1.5 times more than the general population. Native Americans experience PTSD twice as often as the general population. Suicide is the leading cause of death among Native Americans ages 10 to 34. Native Americans abuse drugs and alcohol at a much younger age and at higher rates than all other ethnic groups. And Native Americans and Alaskan Natives have lower life expectancies than any other ethnic group.
Substance abuse, addictions, domestic violence, and all of these other things. Now they're saying, okay, well, you have all of these problems in health, you have all these disparities. Now go find your culture to go back to and to heal.
A culture that's been severely damaged by the very process that has caused this trauma. A little later in the show, we will show you what one group is doing to help Native Americans overcome some of those intergenerational issues. But coming up next, looking back at the history of the Thomas School through the eyes of the people who were there.